Hey guys, so I am a huge Rick Riordan fan. I have not read everything he's written, but he is one of my favorite authors. I absolutely love his work. I am itching for Tyrant's Tomb to come out. I'm so excited for this book. And as a result, I think it's time to do an actual ranking list for Percy Jackson. I've got quite a few ranking lists on the go right now, but it'll be a bit before most of them are actually ready to be filmed. This one I pretty much finished in one sit down, but then I went through it again later and realized, yeah, it's pretty solid. I don't really want to change anything. So yeah, without further ado, this is going to be me ranking all the Percy Jackson books I have read. Just to be clear, I haven't read Magnus Chase, Kane Chronicles, or most of the little side books, such as the Demigod Files, that kind of thing. So this is going to include all the Percy Jackson books, with the exception of Titan's Curse, which for some bizarre reason I have not read yet. That's actually going to be within the next month or so probably. We'll see how it goes. And also the Heroes of Olympus books, the Trials of Apollo books, and then one or two of the side books that I have read. Okay, so at number 13 we have The Dark Prophecy. This is the second book in the Trials of Apollo series. I do think it's a well-written book. I just don't especially like it. As much as I love Apollo's character development, it is very hard to watch, and also one big problem I have with the relationship between him and Meg is the fact that there's clearly a major time bomb that's going to blow up at some point, and to me it feels a little bit like we're just not addressing it. That is probably done on purpose knowing Rick Riordan, so it may be once the rest of the series is out and I read that, I will like this book more, but just for the time being, The Dark Prophecy is number 13 on my list. Okay, and number 12 is The Lost Hero. This is the first book in the Heroes of Olympus series. Now, just to be clear, objectively speaking, I think this is actually a really good book. It introduces Leo Valdez, who is one of my favorite characters in the Percy Jackson saga. However, I do think it's one of the weaker ones Rick Riordan has written. It is very different tonally. I don't think he's quite as comfortable writing the main characters of Jason and Piper as he was with Percy and Annabeth. To be fair, this is the first time he was writing a book that was part of the main central saga that didn't have Percy as a protagonist. Also, this is written in third person, which I believe was quite a shift for Rick Riordan. I've heard him talk before about how Percy's actually the hardest POV character to write in Heroes of Olympus for him, because he's used to writing Percy as first person. And then, of course, as a reader, it's quite jarring that Percy isn't really present at all. So that's the biggest complaint I have with this. That being said, I did still enjoy this book when I read it. Leo is amazing and I love him. And I do actually like Jason and Piper too. I just think that they are less interesting than, say, Percy, at least in this book. In later books, that does change. In spot number 11, we have Sea of Monsters. This is one I do actually own. I don't own all the ones I'm going to be listing as Seeing Through the Dark Prophecy. I do own this one, but it's not in the house right now, so it's not going to get to go in the stack. But the biggest problem I have with this book is the first third. It is well written, but I have a very hard time getting through this. It actually took me two tries spaced a year apart to read Sea of Monsters because I just couldn't get past Tantalus, basically. Which, yeah, Tantalus, oh my goodness, I'll say no more than that. That being said, once you get past that first third, once they actually leave on the quest, the book gets much better. It has some really nice character development for Percy and Annabeth, as well as Grover, Tyson, and quite a few others. Clarice is amazing in this book. And yeah, it is still a book I would recommend. I just don't like that first third. Okay, and in spot number 10, we have Blood of Olympus. Blood of Olympus is the 5th book in the Heroes of Olympus series. It is a good book. I enjoy it. It actually has some of my favorite scenes in the series. There's a couple scenes with Nico that are absolutely spectacular in this book. The biggest problem I have is that the ending is a little bit anticlimactic, especially compared with the ending of the previous series, because as the final book in the Heroes of Olympus saga, this book has a lot of pressure on it. It's being held up to a very high standard. It's assumed that it's going to end well for the series. And it just ends up being a little bit underwhelming. It could be a lot worse, don't get me wrong, but it's not as powerful as it could be. So that's the biggest complaint I have with Blood of Olympus. That being said, still a good book. And at spot number 9, we have Percy Jackson's Greek Gods. I actually really love this book. The only reason it's ranked as low as it is because I haven't finished reading it yet. It's one that I'm slowly working my way through. If you don't know anything about Percy Jackson's Greek Gods and also its companion piece, Percy Jackson's Greek Heroes, which is of course this one, they are essentially history/textbooks that Percy was commissioned to write about Greek heroes and Greek gods. And they are hysterical. It's very, very much Percy Jackson's voice telling these stories, and it's really funny. You can tell that he's very unimpressed with certain things in Greek mythology, and it's really funny. So yeah, totally pick this book up if you haven't already. Okay. And then in spot number 8, we have Mark of Athena. This is the 3rd book in the Heroes of Olympus series. And it's a very, very interesting book because the previous two books have both built up these different character sets, some of which we already know. We already knew Percy and Annabeth, and some of which we are just meeting. And this is the book where they actually are united for the first time and we see them meeting each other, and it's really funny. One of my favorite moments has got to be everyone's reactions to Percy, because just not quite what we expected. That being said, it doesn't really have a lot of things that grab me as much as some of the better books do. I do think it's a good book. I enjoy this book a lot. It has some really interesting stuff with both Jason and Percy, but I especially love the stuff with Leo in this book. There's a scene with Narcissus that is just hysterical. I will say no more than that, but it's amazing. Also very heartbreaking. You find out some stuff about Leo in this book that is just sad, and oh my goodness. Also poor Nico in this book. Poor Nico. And that ending. I'm not going to say any more than that, but that ending. So yeah, Mark of Athena. And in spot number 8, we have The Last Olympian. This is a much, much stronger ending to a series than Blood of Olympus. This is the final book in the original Percy Jackson series. It's almost entirely one massive battle, but it's paced very, very well. And you have a lot of really good character moments, particularly for Percy, Annabeth, and Luke. Also Nico. Nico really shines in this book, even if he's not one of the main parts. And it's very satisfying to have gone through this whole series, in my case excluding Titan's Curse. Yes, I still can't believe I actually skipped over the middle chapter to read the others. I don't really have a lot of specifics to say on this, which is funny given how high it ranks in the list, but yeah, really good book. I'd recommend it. I like the ending to the series. And then in spot number 6, we have Battle of the Labyrinth. I love this book. It is so interesting. I love what they do with some of the supporting characters. I'm not going to say who, apart from Nico, because if you can't tell, Nico is one of my favorite characters in this series, and I love him. But there's a couple of other plots in this as well that I find really, really interesting. The dynamic between Luke, Annabeth, and Percy, it's very, very fascinating, but also just all the supporting characters. And now we're into our top 5. At number 5, we have The Son of Neptune. This is book 2 in the Heroes of Olympus series, and it's also the first time we see Percy written in third-person perspective, which is very, very interesting and kind of bizarre, because in all the previous books, we're stuck in Percy's head. And Percy is a bit impulsive. He does things at times that make no sense to the characters around him, but when you're in his head, it makes perfect sense. So it's really funny reading this book and having scenes where he just does weird stuff, and since you're not seeing it from his perspective, you don't know where his thoughts are. And so to see these other characters just going, what the crap, Percy, stop. You're going to get yourself and probably us killed. And it's just really funny. Also, it's interesting seeing him in such a different environment than we've seen him before, because he is completely taken from everything he knows in this book. And it's really interesting watching him adapt. So yeah, really good book. I love this book so much. Oh, and also as a Canadian, I have to be happy about Frank Jean, because Canadian in this book, and he just feels so Canadian, and I love it. So yeah, that's also a plus for me here. And book number 4, House of Hades. Again, this is one I don't own, so I can't physically hold the book, but I do really love House of Hades. Jason actually has a really interesting journey in House of Hades, where you see him kind of come more into his power as a leader a little bit, and also he starts to be more perceptive regarding certain people, including especially Nico, and it's really, really interesting watching that happen. Also, Annabeth and Percy in their whole plot that I can't really describe without giving major spoilers for some of the other books. But yeah, their whole plot line is so tragic, but and so amazing, and I love it. But yeah, House of Hades, really good book. Now we are into our top tier. Book number 3, The Hidden Oracle. This is the first book in the Trials of Apollo series. Now, just to give a bit of context, Trials of Apollo is the only one of Rick Riordan's series that I have read as it was coming out. So when I first read this book, I didn't have any of the later exposure. Also, because I haven't read Titan's Curse, I have had very minimal exposure to Apollo. I don't know how big his role is in Titan's Curse, I just know he's in it, so I don't know if that would affect anything. Probably wouldn't, honestly. But I love this book so much. It actually took me a couple tries to get through, because Apollo as a character is very grating when this book starts. I probably got about, I'd say, a third to halfway through, and I had to stop and go read one of the other books to distract myself. I think it was either House of Hades or Blood of Olympus, not sure which. And then when I went back to this and finished and kept going, I suddenly was fine with it again. And by the time you reach the end of this book, I just want to give Apollo a hug. Oh my goodness, poor guy. It's like, you have had such a hard life, and it's just so harsh. Everything is so difficult for you, but at the same time, how are you this arrogant? Like, he's so out of touch with reality, and I love it because it puts him in a situation where, one, we can have some really amazing comedy, and two, so much character development, even just within this first book. Also, he's not a combative character in a typical sense. He doesn't carry a sword. He doesn't use typical weapons, which I like. It's interesting and quite different for Rick Riordan. Probably the line that stands out the most to me in this book is, "Oh, horrors, is that acne?" First time he looks in a mirror and sees his human face. And just, I love you, Apollo, but wow. Just, wow. Mega, share your reaction so much. Just, you're average. Oh my goodness. Just, calm down, Apollo. You're fine. But yeah, really funny book. Just, if you're finding Apollo annoying at about the third to halfway mark, that's, I had that, and I've heard a lot of people say that. Just give it a break and come back to it later, and he becomes amazing. And now I actually love that middle section. I just needed some warming up time for it. Okay, and number 2, my silver medalist, is The Lightning Thief. This is, of course, the original Percy Jackson Rick Riordan book. It's the first one to ever be released, and it's amazing. It was my first introduction to the series, excluding the movies, which we're not going to talk about the movies right now, but such a good book. I just love this story so much. Percy is a really engaging main character, and his journey with Annabeth and Grover is really, really interesting. I also love the dynamic between him and all these different monsters. Him and Luke and also Hades have a really interesting dynamic. Not necessarily between Luke and Hades, but between Percy and them. Also Percy and his father. I really like how Rick Riordan addresses the idea of an absentee godly parent in this book, because it's not going to be a healthy relationship. I'm sorry. If you don't even know who your dad is till you're 11, it's not going to be a straightforward relationship, especially if he's an Olympian god. So I'm really glad that he addresses that in an interesting and realistic way in this book. So yeah, really, really good book. Would totally recommend it. Also, Percy Jackson's, I guess, speaking voice and also narrating voice is just hysterical, and I love it. Now, if you've been keeping score, you probably have a pretty good idea what my number 1 is. If not, well, I guess you'll find out in a few seconds. It is The Burning Maze. This is the 3rd book in the Trials of Apollo series, the most recent one when I'm filming this. Next one's coming out next month, which I am really excited about. But I really, really love this book. It is so heartbreaking at certain moments, but at the same time it's not depressing. There's a lot of really legitimately hilarious stuff in this book. And also, I really love seeing how far Apollo has come, but also seeing how much farther he has to go. His dynamic with Meg, you can tell right from the beginning of the book, is very different from what it was in the first book. There's a moment when he pulls out some ambrosia from his pocket and gives it to her, despite the fact that we know he can't eat ambrosia because he's physically human. And we find out the reason he carries it is because he knows that Meg doesn't, and she needs it. That is very considerate for Apollo. When we first meet him, he doesn't really seem to care what other people think. He honestly expects his children to be weeping with joy that he recognizes them in the first book. Which, nice, Apollo? His general dynamic with everyone is really interesting, and the villain of this book is the scariest of the 3 so far. I would say the villain in Hidden Oracle is scary. I personally find the villain in Dark Prophecy a little underwhelming in terms of the fear factor. He's clearly the least powerful of the 3, I would say. But the villain in this book, I'm not going to say his name because it's a little bit of a spoiler, but he is terrifying, and he manages to do some things that I was not expecting. I found out one very major spoiler halfway through, and yeah, okay, that was really, really hard. But I'm glad I did actually read the book thoroughly despite not wanting to read that scene. But, you know, one thing I have noticed with Rick Riordan, and I don't think this is just Rick Riordan, this is kind of it works well for storytelling, so it happens a lot, but Rick Riordan, I noticed in particular, when he has a 5-book series, that 3rd book almost always has something really extreme happen right near the end. So yeah, this book definitely had that. I'm just going to say that much. Also, this book took 2 characters that I personally found okay, but honestly pretty underwhelming, and made them really interesting and amazing. And I love that, especially in the case of Piper. I'm not going to really say much about what happens with Piper, but I love that, and I love what he does with the relationship between Piper and Jason as well, because it's interesting and realistic and not something you see explored very much in books like this. So I'm really glad he does that. One thing that I do want to mention about this book, I would personally say it's the most mature out of the books that I've read, not because the others are immature, not at all, but because this book has some content in it that I wouldn't necessarily recommend for some 9-year-olds, depends on the situation. There's one scene where Apollo goes through some very, very intense physical torture. Not intense for books in general, but intense for a book that's technically marketed at preteens at times. It's not graphic at all, but it's kind of, you can tell it's written from the perspective that Rick Riordan knows that a lot of his audience is growing up. I actually think this is a good thing in the case of this series because it's not gratuitous, but it does feel like he's going, no, these stakes matter. Like, there's some very dangerous stuff going on. And also, Apollo he's not typically heroic. And so when you have scenes like this one where it's very, very self-sacrificial, it allows us to see that no, despite the fact that he's kind of an arrogant jerk at times, he does legitimately care about these people. That's not to say it's a healthy way to do it, but he didn't really have much of a choice in this scenario. So yeah, it's a hard scene to get through by Percy Jackson standards, but I do think that it's an important scene, and it is a scene that I think Rick Riordan was right to include. It's just that compared to how a lot of the earlier books are written, it's definitely more intense, I would say. But again, you can tell that Rick Riordan knows a lot of his audience is growing up, and that's kind of how it comes across to me. Anyway, I'm going to stop now, because I could talk about this book for hours. But yes, Burning Maze, absolutely amazing. I cannot wait for Tyrant's Tomb, because I really want to see where this is going. Anyway, thanks for watching, you guys. If you have any questions regarding my ranking, feel free to ask down below. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. What would your ranking be, actually? Is there anything in here that you think should be switched around? I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Have a lovely day. I will see you all later.